Tonight, a look at the growing tension between China and the West. And joining us for that discussion, Gordon Chang, columnist at Forbes.com and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Wenren Jiang, political science professor at the China Institute at the University of Alberta and senior fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation. Charles Burton, political science professor at Brock University, who's been watching China for almost 40 years now. And Sarah Koutoullakos, executive director at the Canada-China Business Council, rather. It's good to have everybody here. Wenren, thanks for coming all the way from Alberta for this tonight. Good to have everybody for tonight's discussion. You know, of course, about some of the recent irritants in China, the Taiwan arms sale, which they were not very happy about, the situation with Google, where some hacking taking place on Google has made Google question whether they want to stay in China. China and the West, Gordon, let's start with you first, have been huffing and puffing at each other for a very long time. Is there any reason to believe things are more serious now?
I think that they probably are. I mean, there's a lot of, the normal tension in the U.S.-China relation, and I think part of it is that they wanted to test President Obama, for instance, so there seems to be more American issues. But I think part of it is also structural in the sense that there might be some internal dissension inside the regime in Beijing and, over succession, over who knows what. And I think part of it is that when you have this political struggles, it's very difficult for senior officials to take accommodating positions with other nations, and especially the United States. So I think that part of this really sort of is reflective of the nature of the regime.
Sarah, is the huffing and puffing more serious these days?
I guess I would tend to agree with Gordon, but maybe even worry about it a bit less. Some of the tensions we're seeing with the U.S. It looks to me like deja vu. Someone visits with the Dalai Lama and China needs to make noise about it. Same thing with arms sales to Taiwan. However, it is important to look at the patterns of what we're seeing. China does show some inclination to try to flex its muscle every once in a while. And is that flexing kind of the ebb and flow, or are they really trying to show more power? I think that's something that can't be answered in just one day. And certainly the internal tension that's going on is very much there. And
Wenren Jiang, how do you see it?
Well, I think they're both existing and historical issues like Taiwan, Tibet, the tensions between two big powers. One is existing, another is rising, inevitable. Some people say, well, this phase of tension will pass, much ado about nothing. But there are new issues, though, on the other hand. Google versus China. This is how to handle information issues, information warfare, cyber attacks in the future, geostrategic military manner. I mean, climate change. Copenhagen now squarely, by the West, virtually blamed on China. China saying, not our fault. So how do you kind of deal with these newly emerging issues? Thus, I think we need to explore further.
Charles, you took your first trip to China when?
1978.
1978. You've been watching it for a long time.
Before that, yeah.
How do you think?
Well, I think that there is a lot of difference in the way China is responding with the West as compared to the past. The nature of the relationship has changed. It used to be that the West gave China financial aid, which meant that China was more amenable to agreeing to participate in Western-dominated regimes. Those days are over. It's become a shift in balance between who needs who more. And it seems that China is now able to challenge the West and say, well, if you sell arms to Taiwan, we're going to make it hurt. We'll stop buying from Lockheed and Boeing. At least they make such threats. Or if you see the Dalai Lama, we won't come to meet your president. And so this is different from the past where there was the huffing and puffing, but once the Dalai Lama flew back to India, nothing seemed to happen. Now it seems that things are starting to happen, and that does suggest that the West is under something of a challenge in knowing how to address this new situation.
Although the most recent meeting with the Dalai Lama and President Obama was pretty quick and not very public, wasn't it?
Yes, I'd say that's so. I think that previously, that when the Dalai Lama was in Washington for the first time since 1991, the United States president did not meet with the Dalai Lama. And I think the expectation of not meeting with the Dalai Lama was that China would give. Would China make some concessions on the currency issue so the U.S. could have better access to the Chinese market? Or would China, be amenable to agreeing to some resolution of the Copenhagen Accords? Turns out that not meeting with the Dalai Lama got the United States nothing. If anything, it seems that China got the perception that the United States was weak. and thereby it emboldened China to become more confrontational and assertive, which was exactly the opposite to what President Obama and Hillary Clinton, I think, anticipated.
Let me read you all something from Der Spiegel on the issue of commerce and reform. Here we go, Michael. Let's bring this board up. The Communist Party's increasing confidence means China is set to become more of a troublemaker on the international stage and more brutal in its crackdown on dissidents. The Chinese government is brimming with self-confidence bordering on arrogance. The Chinese see themselves as the winners of the global economic crisis. The West should bid farewell to its cherished notion that China's economic progress will lead to political liberalization and turn it into a responsible partner on the world stage. The reverse is likely to be the case. Gordon, you agree with that?
Well, I think that there's certainly a lot of truth to that. I think part of the problem, it's not just this self-confidence. I think that there are problems in the regime. Also, you got to remember that China has become a very unruly society. There were perhaps more than 127,000 mass incidents in 2008. And so I think that you have all of this economic engagement with China has created a very interesting, very volatile society. And the Communist Party has a hard time actually trying to keep up. So I think that, yes, political and economic engagement is changing China. It's going to change China for the better. But nonetheless, we could have some very turbulent periods between now and then, because it might not be a gradual evolution that everybody wants. It could go back to what we've seen in Chinese history, which is very, very difficult, turbulent, chaotic, and even violent political changes.
Sarah, should we get rid of this idea that trade liberalization is going to lead to political liberalization over there?
I wouldn't give up that idea, but I think it's important to look at what might be behind some of the sort of bellicose behavior that you see, because although the statement says that China may have seen itself as winning through this global economic crisis, there are signs of fragility in the economy, and the government would rather not have its people focus on that. So by taking a strong position on the world stage, it increases feelings of nationalism, which sometimes are good, sometimes are bad, I think, in the opinion of the Chinese government. But in doing that, it helps them feel more confident, perhaps directing attention away from some of the weaknesses of the economy.
Wenren Jiang?
Well, actually, I'm not sure I agree with this kind of Western consensus somehow recently emerging as if China is now, with economic power growing, with military power growing, somehow getting more confident and therefore more arrogant in dealing with, external players, internal issues. China perceives itself very differently. The leadership, many fairly well informed intellectuals in the policy circle feel a more sense of crisis rather than confidence. They feel China today, Gordon mentioned some of those elements of internal issues. China, by per capita income levels, about $3,000. There's not even close to be a global superpower. They know that. And then the issue of social instability, about jobs, and jobs, it's not just here in the United States that we talk about jobs. They talk about jobs in China as well. And there's international environment. What we here in the West perceive to be an emerging, arrogant China, but the Chinese themselves actually perceive themselves as being more and more, in some sense, militarily, economically, and politically squeezed by the Western countries, if not in a conspiracy sense, but in some ways they're pressuring China to do something China is not ready to do.
Charles,
and they're not ready to take up that.
Sorry, do you agree, Charles, that they don't see themselves as arrogant the way we, I shouldn't say we, but some in the West believe?
Oh, I think that they see themselves as deserving of respect. I think that from our point of view, our expectation had been when China started to open up its economy, that there would be changes in the political system commensurate, that a middle class would form, and this middle class would own property and want to have a political system that would be responsive to their property rights and would feel an entitlement to rights. And we haven't seen this developing the way we had hoped. China did sign the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1998. And when you sign one of those covenants, the expectation is that you will change your laws and procedures to become compliant with the demands of the covenant and then ratify. But all those things that China, by signing, suggested that they would do, such as free elections and freedom of expression and freedom of association, And freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, all these things which we regard as the universal entitlement of all citizens, have not been, we haven't seen any progress towards ratification of that covenant. And so there's no question that our assumption that China's economic rise would see China smoothly entering into international regimes and following along with a shared consensus of values of how a regime should behave domestically and internationally has not come to pass. And that's a cause for considerable concern for all of us.
Do you agree that the progress has been very slow?
I agree the progress is there, but I disagree with Charles' assessment on how we view China. Charles has been observing China for a long, long time. So I would say let's look at historically where China is heading to in the past 3 decades. Let's not see past several months. Yes, on human rights issues, on the political side, there are more dissidents probably cracking down in recent months, in recent past year also. But let's remember, China probably also leading the rest of the world in prosecuting corruption officials of its own party. Last year alone, 30-some provincial level high cadres being convicted of corruption charges, some of them long sentences, some of them being executed. This is a country that is trying to move towards the rule of law, step by step. So I kind of a little bit taken back by some of the very informed China experts and watchers in the West saying what we invested in China on legal reform and all that, we do not see progress. I think we need to manage our own expectations on where China is heading rather than saying these are the bar that they're not met, so we need to do something else.
Charles, you want to come back at that?
Well, I think it's not just about human rights and domestic law, but it's also about how China interacts in global institutions. You know, is China pushing the envelope beyond the accepted limits in terms of its interpretation of the WTO? What about the 6-party talks? On the one hand, China says that they want to work with the 6 parties to resolve the nuclear crisis in North Korea. And on the other hand, they recently gave North Korea $10 billion worth of aid, which seems to go against the idea that, you know, we'll support North Korea if they promise to make progress on reducing their world threat. What about China's support for the regime in Burma, which, you know, is supported by Chinese trade in minerals and wood? What about China's reluctance to cooperate in the Security Council with regard to sanctions against Iran's nuclear program? What about Zimbabwe? What about Darfur? All sorts of areas where or for that matter, Copenhagen, where we don't see China prepared to work together with the other powers to ensure a prosperous and peaceful world. It's a cause for concern.
Let me pick up on something Wenren sang a second ago, and because it does maybe reflect the different headspace that our 2 respective countries or jurisdictions are in. You mentioned a long time. Now, in the West, a long time politically can be a few months. In other places in the world, and if I've got the quote wrong, I know you'll all help me out here, was it Chairman Mao, when asked about the French Revolution, what do you think of it, said, well, still too early to say?
Zhou Enlai, yeah.
Zhou Enlai? Was it Zhou Enlai? Okay. In other words, Gordon, have we given China enough time, not by our standards, but by their standards, to be more of what we want them to be?
I think that, you know, if you look at the way societies progress, it took, for instance, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand a long time to develop from authoritarian states to more liberal democracies. And so, you know, this is a question of time, and it does take decades. I think the problem right now is that, as Charles mentioned, there are a number of very critical issues that are pressing the world, such as Iran, North Korea, climate change. And China is not at the point where it is willing to be cooperative with the rest of the international community. And I think it's a real problem, because now the issue is not the direction that China is going in, but the time frame, because we need solutions now. We need China to be cooperative now. And the ultimate test, I think, of Beijing's ability to work with the international system is the one issue you mentioned, which is sanctions on Iran, which looks like it's speeding towards a nuclear weapons program that would certainly destabilize not only its region, but the entire world. So this is going to be a very critical thing, and I think time is the issue.
You're with, Sarah, the Canada-China Business Council, so let me ask you a business question here.
Okay.
And the Google story has been the biggest business story in the headlines lately when it comes to China. Some would say that this example, Chinese, whoever, whether it was government officials or you know, hackers not affiliated with the government, hacking into those Gmail accounts and trying to steal the intellectual property behind the magic algorithm that makes Google so magic. It shows that making money and the cost of doing business in China is still way too high and therefore not worth it. What's your view?
I think it's an isolated example, and it's hard to make that general statement from that. Certainly, the Google situation is very interesting for a number of reasons. Of course, you can see that there's a sector, there's an industry, their particular section of it, where a company does have to make a decision. Do I want to play in that country according to the rules? And actually, it's quite interesting to watch how Google is really trying to shake things up by making this threat to leave. So on an individual company basis, you need to make that decision as to can you make enough money and how high is the price. But I think in terms of the general business community, there's a very strong feeling that being there is much more valuable than not being there. You can make many more changes from within than you can from without. And in addition, looking at the technology sector, there's another element of pressure on the system that is going to take its own pace regardless of what the Chinese government wants. And that's that, look at Google's censorship. You can get around it. People do it all the time. It takes some effort. But how do you slow down technology, and how does the Chinese government keep up with all of the ways to censor it? It's going to be impossible in the long term. And so I love that kind of from around the fringes, there are pressures being put in ways that are difficult to control.
Let me hear from the others on this as well. Charles?
Well, I think the thing about Google is that when Google went in, the expectation was that the Chinese censorship would reduce. But what Google says is the number of terms that they were asked to censor are increasing year by year. So you're seeing a reverse process to the expectation. But I do think with regard to the Google situation, every country in the world has security agencies that are interested in looking at foreign emails and communications. It's a normal part of international relations. But what China is doing is not simply looking at terrorists or criminals, but evidently, according to what we're told, the security agency is investigating political dissidents and even people in Canada and the United States who have connections with China who are involved in the human rights movement, and also industrial espionage, which for the other agencies like Canada's Communications Security Establishment or the National Security Agency of the United States is not something that they would do. And so there again, there's an unspoken sort of consensus of acceptable behavior, and China seems to be moving beyond the sort of what is allowed. Within you take the WTO, no nation follows the WTO terms to the letter. There's a kind of space that's acceptable for moving in your own national interest. But it seems that in the case of China, China moves beyond the space and starts to try and apply norms which are not the consensus of the global community. And I think the Google example is a clear example of how China and the rest of us are not really on the same page about how we should be relating to each other.
Wenren Jiang, what does the Google situation say to you?
Let's just break down the Google story a little bit more, rather than making some general assumptions. I don't think it really stands well. I myself do not like censorship at all. I use Google myself. I think the Chinese, many of the young people like to have Google in China. And Google provides good opportunities. I think Google's original decision in 2006, the rationale for going to China, it still stands correct. That is, to be there providing the limited information is better to provide no information at all. But let's look at it. Google.cn has very little percentage of market. The Google.com is still open to the Chinese. So if tomorrow Google leaves China, there's still room for Chinese to grow. This doomsday scenario somehow, if Google tomorrow leaving China, China's 380 million largest internet user will be just collapse. It's actually laughable.
No, but can I
China
understand that?
would go on to its own pace.
Let me just understand this.
Yeah.
Google.cn is in
a Chinese language search engine.
So Google.com presumably would not be helpful for the many people who don't speak English.
You can still search in Chinese in there, and you can still use it. What I'm saying is Google in China will be helpful. But tomorrow Google leaves China as the way they threaten it is not going to be very helpful to the most Chinese users. But it's also, the second point related to this is about espionage, about the warfare on the cyberspace. There is so far no proof. Am I listening to Google CEO, or am I going to listening to Microsoft CEO and Bill Gates and others who said thousands of these attacks go on daily? What is the proof on Google's claim? There was no proof. Now the National Security Agency just got involved to investigate. They say it might be someone in Shanghai wrote a code and posted it on the internet, and some others used that code to attack. So we really don't know. So therefore, I think we should not jump into conclusions and paint all this, the Chinese government as the bad guy and we're all the good guys. It's actually a lot more complex.
Gordon?
I think one of the interesting things about Google is the context in which it occurred. Since about the middle of 2006, the Chinese government has really made it very difficult for foreign investors in China. They have been restricting takeovers. They've been issuing all sorts of rules that require the transfer of technology, all sorts of things to favor local competitors, especially in connection with the stimulus program that Beijing announced in November 2008. So essentially what you've got is a much more difficult environment. And what Google is basically saying is that, yes, there's an advantage to being in China, but on the other hand, there's a cost. And they're starting to weigh, well, maybe the cost is more than the advantage. And that's, I think, a real watershed for business. I don't know if Google will leave, but I think that what you're starting to see among foreign businessmen and women in China is more of an appreciation of maybe it's not important to be there if the costs are that high.
Sarah?
Yeah, well, and that's an equation that every company has to make because it has to make financial sense. What you've mentioned about some of the difficulties in doing business, and which really leads to kind of the protection issue, is definitely something we're watching at the Council. Just some of the regulatory procedures and hoops that people need to jump through, in many cases, have been getting harder. And China has been changing regulations in many ways to subtly, sort of, or not so subtly, protect its own companies. And a good example of that is this indigenous innovation policy that came out a couple months ago, which basically says if you're going to be involved in government procurement, there will be preference given to intellectual property that comes from Chinese companies.
Okay, but weigh it for us, if you would. There is a cost to staying in China, whether it's the cost of dealing with all this bureaucracy or the cost of a hit on Google's reputation for putting up with some of the things that it wouldn't put up with in other countries. How do you weigh that cost-benefit analysis at the moment?
Ultimately, I think you have to do it at the company level. Does it fit with your company's values, and will your shareholders approve? And
well,
if
their
you look
values
at,
we know are do no evil, right? That's number one.
Yeah.
Are they doing evil by staying and putting up with this?
Well, not if, as Wenran says, by being there, you can feel like you're making a contribution to progress.
Okay, Charles.
I mean, let's get clear on this. You cannot access any Blogspot blogs from China, including mine, not just for me. It's there. All the Blogspot blogs, including the ones about people's cats, are not available. You cannot access.
Sorry, not available meaning blocked?
They're blocked. You cannot. Blogspot.com pulls up an error message. If you do the searches on Google.com, you get the same censorship as Google.cn. It's not as if you can somehow go through that. YouTube is not available. You cannot post your Google Docs from within China. I mean, really, when you look at it, what Google services are unaffected in China by the Great Firewall, pretty much all of them. So you could see why the do no evil guys would think that evil is being done there. It's it's hard for me to work in China when I can't post to my blog or access it. Or I like to watch YouTube. I don't even know if I can get the agenda in China. Maybe not this show for sure.
Okay, Wendy.
I think this issue, I agree with Charles on the censorship part. I think the issue of Google versus China really is a bigger issue of how the West is approaching and engaging China today. China, as it is, we acknowledge some of the historical progress. We also see the limitations today. And the issue is, how do we engage China? Are we going to basically do a confrontational approach as Google has been doing? Or we're going to say engage with China and to move China in a direction, in a limited manner, as we can play external forces, corporations, governments, but it's the Chinese themselves will eventually move China forward through their own internal dynamics. I think these are the important issues we need to look at. On the issue of Google or other companies having a political cost in China for doing business, I think it's important to look at this is a logic of global capitalism playing. Chinese leadership, if anything, in the past 3 decades have been having a grand bargain with the global capitalism, coming in with a lot of benefits for foreign capital and depressed salary, damage to the environment, a lot of manufacturing goods. So that's where China is today.
Okay, let me get a couple more quick comments on this part first, Sarah, and then Charles.
Well, on the convincing the Chinese leaders to make changes and whether or not you can make an argument for that being of benefit to within. I think the Green Dam example from last summer is an excellent example. This was the encryption software that the government was going to require to be put on every single computer sold from within China. And there was a lot of action on the part of interested companies, associations. We participated in a 21 association group that wrote letters to ministers and vice premiers, and the Chinese government stood down right around the deadline. And as much as we wanted to think that was our efforts that helped that, the word on the street is that the real reason they made that decision was that the Chinese blogosphere was really up in arms about it. You know,
And they were influenced by that?
that's what we hear.
That's the word on the street.
Yes.
Okay, Charles?
I would just say with regard to the, Google engaging China is a good thing. When Google started in China, you could in fact access YouTube and Blogspot and Google. Well, Google Docs didn't exist then, but it's a backwards progress, not a forwards progress. The longer Google's in China, the less Google you can get. I think when you look at it in general, when I was in China in the 70s, they were also doing political systemic reform, as you say. It's 30 years ago, and then they had another go of it heading up in the late 80s under Zhao Ziyang, which was crushed by the Tiananmen movement. Then we had another go of it in leading up to 1998 for the 20th anniversary of political systemic reform. Now we're in 2010. It's been 30 years. I started off at 24, now I'm 54. Another 30 years I'll be dead. I'm wondering when this political systemic reform thing is going to kick in. And is there any sort of indication of anything progressive, or are we in fact only seeing, backwards?
Here's Min Shin Pei from just last week in the New York Times. The two countries, China and the U.S., are now so economically intertwined that a major disruption in their political relationship could severely damage their respective economic interests, a price neither wants to pay. Economic interdependence also means that neither China nor the U.S. can hurt the other without harming itself. In spite of the heated words in the official Chinese press, it is reassuring to note that Beijing and Washington are merely fighting the same old fights: Taiwan, Tibet, and human rights. Both sides are familiar with the ground rules for these disputes and so far have observed them. Okay, Gordon, to you first on this. Do you believe trade with China has had benefits even without the democratic reforms that many in the West hope for? Absent that, has it still been a positive story?
Well, sure. Trade has been positive for China. It's been positive for the United States. That's generally true about trade between any two countries. And so I certainly think that, both countries have benefited. But that doesn't necessarily mean that both countries see the same going forward. And so even though, Min Shin Pei can think, well, it's always been okay in the past, it should be okay in the future, it's a very different world we live in. China prospered in the post-Cold War period of seemingly never-ending globalization and increasing amounts of wealth. But, since the middle of 2008, we've been living in a very different world. And so therefore, these disagreements that we have, which may be the same, Tibet, Taiwan, trade, whatever, now take on greater significance because the world, countries have a very different attitude towards global trade, among a lot of other things. And so we're in a different era, and so therefore I think that these disputes could become much more serious and much more consequential. And so I don't think we can rely on what we knew in the past, because this is a very different global environment that we're in.
Okay, Charles, your legitimate criticisms that you've put forward this evening notwithstanding, we do have to point out that even though things are tense, there's no war. There doesn't seem to be any threat of war between the United States and China. There are hundreds of millions of extremely poor Chinese who have been lifted out of poverty by virtue of the, liberalized trade that goes on between the two countries. So can we not say that even in the absence of the democratic reforms you want to say, there's a lot of good news here to report?
Oh, absolutely. I think in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights, things have improved. Having, as you know, I lived in China in the 70s, and I saw some terrible poverty, and the numbers of people living in absolute poverty, they don't have enough to keep their bellies full and enough to keep their bodies warm, has gone down probably by 85% over that period. So that's got to be a very positive thing, and people are able to live more dignified lives in China, and that's a very positive thing. I do think that what's happening, though, with the marketization of the economy, with the increasing polarization of wealth, while there's been overall growth, it's been disproportionate, and the coastal cities are enriching themselves much faster than the interior. And this then is risky in terms of continued political stability. Eventually, people feel that the trickle-down effect is not trickling down to them sufficiently, and it causes, even though they're better off than they were before, their resentment is greater because their expectations have not been fulfilled.
That threatened political instability has been forecast for a long, long time. Hasn't happened yet.
I hope it doesn't happen, and you know, we will be meeting in 30 years, and we can discuss it at that time. But I do think that this situation of increasing polarization of wealth is a relatively new and increasing phenomenon, and I do think a lot of China's behavior with the foreign countries is really responsive to domestic concerns.
Okay, let me follow up with Wenren Jiang, and I'm going to read something that Daniel Dresner, whom we all know, he's been on this program as we've tackled this topic many times in the past. I think he's Tufts University, isn't he, Daniel Dresner? Anyway, here's what he had to say on foreign policy. From cyber attacks to obstinacy in Copenhagen, Beijing's assertiveness and the hardening tone of its diplomacy are prompting a rethink. If the competitive aspects of the relationship with China are going to dominate in the years ahead, have the United States and Europe got their strategies right? Talk of giving Beijing more space on sensitive issues has evaporated. Support from business lobbies has weakened. Heads of government who would happily push China into the important but not urgent file have begun to review their strategies. In which case, do you think the West ought to be taking a harder line on China so that China will do more of what the West would like?
Well, a short answer is that a harder line, a so-called pushback, would be counterproductive. But let's step back a little bit. Look at, say, the past decade. Which country or the countries in the world actually has the largest foreign policy failures and blunders? You know, where in the world around that war is going on, civilians constantly being killed and not even making the front page news? I mean, Chinese having a lot of problems. They could have done a lot more on the foreign policy area. But look, China has been in the foreign policy area, I would say globally, if you measure it, pretty moderate. On North Korea, earlier Charles mentioned, on North Korea, China is the one that proposed engagement and is producing latest effect is that the North is coming back to the six-party talks and is opening up for political and economic reform, primarily in the economic side. Those are economic incentives Beijing provided. Call it carrot, versus sugar, or you can stake whichever way you're doing it. So on Iran, China does not see fundamentally the nuclear issue on Iran is a China's core national interest. It is American and Western European agenda. China does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. They made it clear. But it is the approach of how to stop that nuclear weapons program is the difference of the core.
Well, they differ,
yeah.
too. Do you think the West needs to take a tougher line on China, Gordon?
Well, maybe not necessarily tougher, but a different one. We would all like to think that if we're conciliatory to the Chinese, that they'll be conciliatory to us. But after 30 years, I think that what we have seen is that China respects strength much more than friendship, which they even despise if they think that it is a sign of weakness. So I think that what we need to do is we need to stop making excuses for China. I think that we need to stop treating it as a special case.
Sorry, you pointed at Wenren when you said that.
I
He's
did?
making excuses for China?
I didn't realize I did that.
Yeah, here's what you did. You said we need to stop making excuses for China, and you pointed at him. Did you mean to suggest that he is?
Yeah, I think that he probably is. Because I think the one thing that we really need to do is we need to expect from China what we expect from every other country, and that is reciprocity. And we haven't been doing that.
Okay, I better give you a chance to come back at that.
I think if Gordon, which I respect a lot, has written extensively on China, on globalization, on North Korea, and I just hope that you're being from the United States, you can step up on the human rights issues to the US government as much as we talk about the Chinese government. I think that's very important. If we look at the global stage, I'm not making excuses. There's no excuses for China to make on the foreign policy area. What they do on the blunder side, I do not see the scale of the Iraq war or of that scale.
Just so I'm clear, you're suggesting the United States has as many human rights violations as China does?
I mean, we're talking about we need to measure the bar at the same level rather than picking on China. I'm not accusing Gordon in any way of making excuses
Sarah's
for the US.
shaking her head here. Go ahead. Let me
But nor should we lose the balance on the issue. You know?
Sarah, you shook your head there.
Well,
What do you-
I think, you know, the core of the problem is that an expectation has developed that China should be a good multilateral actor. They acceded to the WTO. All of the processes seem to be in place to say they were going to be good global citizens. And now there are some indications that they're not performing on that, on that front. And interestingly, everybody talks about Copenhagen, where China really took a very hard line. At Davos, they sent Li Keqiang to basically say, we're really needing to focus on our own internal issues. We're not going to be able to do as much global cooperation as you might like, and we're really focusing internally. So it almost comes back to the stability issue, where what do they need to do to make sure that there's economic growth that creates stability to keep things going the way they want them to. But what that means is that the expectation that sort of with great wealth, which may not be wealth on a per capita basis, but in terms of the rest of the world, they're very powerful, but they're not able to show on the other aspects of a good multilateral actor that they're playing a part.
Let me just hear from Charles on the issue of whether the West needs to take a tougher line, then we'll come into the audience.
I mean, tougher is a very strong word. I think a smarter line, I think a more honest line in interaction between China and the West. There's a lot of distrust on both sides, and I think it would be better if we were franker with each other about our interests and not play these sorts of games. And so I think that that's the future. Both sides have to take each other more seriously and realize that we have to work together for global peace and prosperity, and therefore we should stop pretending things that we don't mean. For example, the Western government's so-called engagement with China on political issues. This is designed to undermine the basis of the current regime in China and bring about a different society that wouldn't be led by the Chinese Communist Party. It's probably inappropriate for governments directly to be engaging in that kind of interaction with China, which naturally would cause the Chinese government to doubt the motivations of these governments in other areas. We should be maybe doing it on a not a government-to-government basis, but a people-to-people basis. So I think it's time for more honesty and more engagement and more trust building between the two sides.